So Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh is an environmental psychologist specializing in perception and behavior in relation to climate change, energy, and transport. She is the director of the Center for Climate Change and Social Transformation. Her research projects have included studies of energy efficiency, behavior, waste reduction, and carrier bag reuse, perception of smart technologies, electric vehicles, low carbon lifestyle, and responses to climate change. Between 2014 and 2019, she held a prestigious European Research Council starting grant, Low Carbon Lifestyle and Behavioral Spillover, and since 2019 holds an ERC Consolidator grant, Understanding and Leveraging Moments of Change for Pro-Environmental Behavior Shifts. She is also a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change in Working Group 2, and regularly advises government and other organizations on low carbon behavior change and climate change communication. And it brings me immense pleasure that I reached out to Lauren also partly for looking for research collaborations, which it's currently going on in early stages. But she kindly agreed to give a talk to all of you, primarily to the environment and psyche students who are doing. And as you can see, her work intersects with pro-environmental consumption behavior, climate anxiety, as well as behavioral change. So, and I'm really glad, Lauren, that you could make it to this. I'm sure students will gain a lot. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to join you. And I've got some slides, but please do, if anything is unclear, just make a noise or raise a hand and let me know if you have some questions. Okay, let me just share those. Hopefully you can see that. And there'll be plenty of time at the end as well for discussion.
Yes, we can see that clearly.
Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, my research is really very much around how can we engage people with climate change and how can we change behavior as well. Of course, we know that the risks of climate change are increasing. We have evidence from the IPCC, for example, that the type of risks that we're seeing are now affecting all of us. And so in the UK, for example, this is actually becoming a reality that people are starting to realize that we are being affected. We had record temperatures this year in the summer and drought, and we've become used to severe risks of flooding and other things too. But of course, developing countries are particularly vulnerable. And what the IPCC also tells us is that in order to reduce or mitigate these risks, we absolutely need to be cutting our emissions very significantly. And as part of that very significant reduction in emissions, because we need to get to, basically net zero emissions by the middle of this century, we will need new technologies, but we will absolutely need behavior change. So technological change alone will not be enough to help us reach our carbon targets. Most of the measures needed to reach net zero will involve at least some degree of behavior change. And actually, when we look at how much behavior change is needed, of course, this differs across different countries according to their emissions profiles, their carbon footprint. And in the UK, we're one of the highest emitters, so we have to get our carbon footprint down, the average person's carbon footprint down from 8.5 tons of CO2 per person to 2.5 tons within about the next 7 years. So that's an enormous radical transformation that we have to achieve within the UK. But actually, this figure is helpful because it does include India as well. So the average Indian carbon footprint is 3 tons of CO2 per person. But of course, that's increasing very significantly as incomes grow. So while there is less for Indian people to change their behavior, there is, in terms of aspirations and where carbon footprints are moving within India and similar countries, there is a significant change needed to get to 2.5 tons by just 2030. And I think one of the other things that's really important when we're thinking about behavior change is that this is not just about what we buy. So yes, we are consumers. So part of the behavior change we're talking about is things like switching from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles, for example, or ideally from driving to less polluting modes of transport like walking and cycling, or changing our diet in lots of ways to eat less meat and eat more plant-based foods, for example, and so on. But apart from those things that we can do to directly reduce our carbon footprint, there are other things that we can do to try and change society more widely. So we're all citizens as well. So we can vote, we can protest, we can speak to our politicians to try and achieve wider change within society, the policies that we need to get to net zero. Many of us are investors. If we have a bank account or a pension, there are choices that we can make to invest that money in greener sorts of funds or investments. There are things that we can do in a range of contexts within communities. Maybe we're parents, or we have friends and families and neighbours. We, in effect, can be a role model in those diverse situations that we're in. So anytime that we choose to do something low carbon, we're in effect sending a signal that this is something that is desirable, normal. This is something that you think is important. And so you're communicating that through that sort of role modeling function. And then we are also members of organizations. So many of us, either as students at universities, or if we're professionals in our jobs, there are things that we can do, decisions that we can make every day within our jobs to reduce the carbon footprint of ourselves and our organizations. And so using that professional capacity is also very important. So I really like this figure, because it kind of highlights that actually when you think about behavior change, you can think about it in a very broad sense in terms of all of these different ways in which we can exert influence. When we look at the sorts of behaviors that need to change, and the big caveat here is that this is data from Europe, and so the specific figures may be different within an Indian context, but it's helpful at least to look at the relative difference between some of these changes that people can make. So for example, the average person in the UK, if they gave up their car altogether, they would reduce their carbon footprint by about 2 tons of CO2. And remember, we have to get from about 8.5 tons to 2.5 tons in this country. So that would make a really big difference. If you look down, then reducing flying, having a vegan diet, switching to renewable heating, all of those sorts of things would make quite a big difference. And it's interesting, though, if you talk to people about what they think that is effective to tackle climate change, very often they will talk about waste behaviours. They will say, well, I try to recycle, or I bring my own reusable cup to the cafe. Those sorts of things to reduce waste are assumed to be very effective. Now, in actual fact, they are very ineffective. They are worth doing because they do reduce waste and reduce energy consumption, but relative to these other things, actually they're not so effective. So there is a job to educate people to actually highlight what is effective. It's also important to think about whose behavior needs to change. And while what's on this slide focuses particularly within a particular national context like the UK, of course this applies globally when we're comparing different countries, because the size of people's carbon footprint, as we've seen on the earlier slide, is extremely different across different countries. But even within countries, if you look at the size of the wealthiest 10% compared to the poorest 10%, the size of carbon footprint is vastly bigger for the wealthiest in society. So income tends to be one of the biggest predictors of carbon footprint. That suggests that the people that really need to change are those on the highest incomes. But we can also, it's also worth thinking about the opportunities to change behaviour may be different for different groups within society. So if we think about people in rural versus urban areas may have better access to public transport, for example, than those in rural areas. People living in different sorts of housing, people with disabilities, all of these different characteristics that people have will mean that different options are more or less available to people. So it's important then to tailor the intervention according to the groups within society and their different capacities and need to change. Well, the good news, I suppose, is that the public actually, broadly speaking, is very aware of climate change. This is on a global level. Actually, all of the data across lots of countries highlight that there's good awareness and there's concern about climate change as well, and that this has been increasing steadily in the last few years. So actually, I just looked at the figures for India, and about 81% of the public in India say that they are concerned about climate change, which is actually very similar to the figure in the UK. This is just over 80% as well. And that's risen in recent years. And similarly, all these different surveys, that they have different ways of asking these questions, but there is a feeling amongst most of the people polled that actually people feel that they have a role to play in tackling climate change. For example, nearly 3/4 in the UK say, if individuals like me do not act now to combat climate change, we'll be failing future generations. So although people do generally see that governments need to take a lead, they also feel that they should play a role. However, despite that those sentiments that we should act and we want to act, we know that actually emissions in most countries are still climbing. We had a dip during COVID, but actually, broadly speaking, emissions are going up in many countries. So despite public concern, there are reasons why people are actually not yet changing their behaviour. And these include barriers at the individual level, barriers to behaviour change, like maybe not knowing exactly what's effective. I've already mentioned that people think that recycling is very effective when actually changing travel habits is more likely to be effective. And of course, competing motivations, a tendency to focus on the here and now rather than the future. All of those sorts of psychological barriers can be important as well. But perhaps I would say a bigger category of behaviours tends to be the sort of social, economic and structural barriers. The feeling that governments are not doing very much, business is not doing very much, other people are not doing very much. There is a social norm to consume, the aspirations to have a big house, a car, to have wealth and to have material consumption. All of those things mean that it's very difficult to get people to adopt lower carbon alternatives. The cost of those alternatives can, in many cases, be higher, so they can be that can be an impediment. They can be very inconvenient. Obviously, there are international differences, but like the availability of public transport, for example, may be limited in many cases for people. So they have to rely on the car, for example. And there can be a lack of engagement. There is a feeling that the public don't necessarily feel like they are part of a transition to a low carbon future. And so I'll come back to that as well. So how can we change behavior? Well, given lots of these various barriers I've just mentioned, there are both downstream and upstream types of interventions to remove these barriers. And there are lots of ways of categorizing interventions, but I like this one. It's very simple. Downstream interventions are where you're trying to directly influence individuals' choices directly. And this is usually by giving them information, by persuading them, informing them, educating them through information of some kind. And so that could be labels, or it could be advertising campaigns, or as shown on this slide, this is an extract from a menu from a cafe where they were trialing putting CO2 information against the menu choices, so that you could see that the red meat choice, the lamb stew there, had a much higher carbon footprint than any of the vegetarian options, for example. And so if you're motivated to reduce your carbon footprint and you notice that information and it persuades you to try something else, that then giving that information at that time can be effective. However, what we know is that in general, it's not very effective by itself. So actually information alone tends to only be about 2 to 3% effective in changing behavior. And that's because of those wider barriers I mentioned, those more structural, social, economic barriers. And because of those wider barriers, we need upstream measures. We need to influence the context in which people are acting. So we need to change the price of things. So actually, in this particular case, that, well, the lamb stew is actually very expensive. So that may be enough to then dissuade some people to choose it. But often the economic barriers are against choosing a low carbon choice. So we need to remove those barriers. We also need to make low carbon options more available and phase out, ideally, high carbon choices. And we could do that through regulation. So we could just ban certain polluting products, or through changing, sort of using nudges, as they're called, so that you make low carbon products more available. Maybe it's the default, it's the easy choice. And it's maybe harder to choose the higher carbon options. And we can change the built environment. So we can actually physically change the design of cities in order to make it easier to walk, cycle, use low carbon heating, and so on. We know a lot about how to give people information in ways that is more effective. So although I've said it tends to be by itself relatively ineffective, we can at least make it more effective through certain mechanisms. We can, for example, target the time and place at which we give people information. So the example I just gave of the menu, well, that's at the point at which you're making a decision. So we can, so that's likely to be more effective than just if you see a documentary, for example, or a campaign about red meat and the impact it has on the environment. You might think, oh, maybe I should reduce my red meat consumption. But when it comes to the actual moment of making a dietary choice, perhaps you forget about that. So having the information at the point at which you're choosing something is much more likely to be effective. This is why putting labels on things, eco labels, can have some impact, or putting stickers on light switches and asking people to switch off the light as they leave the room, that can be noticed and has some effect. Also, we can frame that information in ways that target what people really care about. Now, we know that people do say they care about climate change, but what we also know is that the most important factors that influence people's behavior tend to be economic factors, health factors, family considerations, convenience, etc. Those would be more pressing or salient motivations. And so if we can give people information that highlights that actually some of these low carbon choices do save you money, save you time, are healthier, if they can highlight those wider co-benefits, as we call them, then they're more likely to be effective in persuading people because they will resonate with what people care about. And this has been shown in various studies. For example, a study where they closed an office car park actually in order to be more energy, to reduce the emissions of the organization, to discourage people from driving. When they communicated that to employees in terms of what employees cared about, and that ranged from, some people wanted to save money, some people wanted to get more exercise, some people wanted to have more time to read on the bus, for example. Highlighting some of those benefits to individuals made that intervention more likely to be supported by those people. And the good news is that actually most of the things that can be done to mitigate climate change do have wider benefits for us: health benefits, well-being benefits, economic benefits in terms of green jobs, for example. So the IPCC have published evidence to show that there are these many co-benefits, which is great if we want to communicate more effectively. Just to illustrate one of these co-benefits, which is well-being, what we know is that materialism tends to negatively affect well-being. So there's now quite a strong body of evidence that people that really value buying things, having lots of things, possessions, and that tend to define themselves through those physical possessions, they tend to overall have lower well-being, life satisfaction, etc. Whereas what we've shown across a number of different countries, including India, the UK, and several others, is that actually there is a positive correlation between subjective well-being, in other words, how satisfied you feel with life, how happy you feel on a day-to-day basis, and people's pro-environmental behaviour, the extent to which they have green lifestyles, and we measured that through asking about lots of different behaviours. So because there is that positive relationship, actually, I think this is something that we can use to communicate with people about reducing their carbon footprint, because actually, contrary to the way in which many people assume is the case with regards to tackling climate change, that we have to give up aspects of our life, it's about sacrifice. Actually, the contrary seems to be the case, actually, is that people that have low carbon lifestyles tend to be happier. And so perhaps it actually improves quality of life. And so I think that's something that then, we can communicate that to motivate people to be part of this change. And of course, we know that spending time in nature also improves well-being and the motivation to be green. So again, we can encourage people to develop a connection with nature, spending time within natural environments, which not only benefits them individually in terms of their mental health, but also will motivate them to reduce their carbon footprint. So that's another strategy linked to that. I'm just going to pause at this point just to see whether there are any questions before I go on, because I've covered quite a lot so far. So were there any questions or comments?
Any questions? No, you can go on. Thank you.
Okay, great. So linked to my point just now about the relationship between mental health and climate action. In other words, as I mentioned, people that are greener tend to be happier, and that people that spend time in natural environments tend to have greener lifestyles as well. We were interested in some recent work to see what the relationship was between climate anxiety and climate action. We hear a lot about climate anxiety. We hear that lots of people, including young people in particular, are very worried about climate change and feel like this could be impacting on their mental health because of the levels of anxiety. But we were interested to see if that was, in fact, like how prevalent that was, particularly within the UK. So this is where we were doing our research. But there have been a few studies in other countries, and they all find actually very similar findings. In our study, so we did this over a 2-year period. So we did an initial survey in 2020, and then we followed up just a few months ago with the same group of people, actually. And it was a representative sample of the UK. And we were looking at what predicted climate anxiety using the scale that Susan Clayton and colleagues in the US have developed, the climate change anxiety scale. And to see whether climate anxiety had any relationship between with climate action. And what we found was that whereas well, almost 80% of the public said they were worried about climate change, only 4% had really any significant level of climate anxiety. So very low levels. I should say the way in which climate anxiety is measured on that scale is in a very sort of clinical way. It's about kind of your sleep is disrupted, you can't concentrate, it's affecting your relationships and so on. So it's worded in a way that's quite similar to the generalized anxiety sorts of measures. So it is about, you know, actually having quite a significant impact on people's functioning. So only 4% are reporting any sort of significant degree of those sorts of symptoms, which I guess is good. And it does, those people that do report those sorts of symptoms are more likely to have generalized anxiety as well. There's quite a strong relationship there, so they tend to be anxious in general. And we also interestingly found that people that are more mindful tend to have lower levels of climate anxiety, which was an interesting and new finding. We did, as expected, find that young people have higher climate anxiety. That's been found consistently. And that people that were more connected to nature had higher climate anxiety. So if you value nature, you're more worried about climate change. Interestingly, though, there was no relationship with direct experience of climate impact. Specifically, we asked about flooding because that's the biggest one that we experience in the UK. And that is interesting, because then when we found what was a more likely predictor, actually it was more indirect information. In other words, so if you read and see a lot of information about climate change in the media, you are more likely to experience climate anxiety. So it's that sort of indirect experience which seems to be a stronger predictor rather than actually, for example, being flooded. I think there's lots maybe to think about there, but this may be like why are people feeling climate anxious, and part of it may be the way in which it's conveyed in the media. However, for the purposes of what we were particularly interested in and related to what I was just talking about, we actually found that people with higher levels of climate anxiety were more likely to take certain actions to reduce their carbon footprint. They bought secondhand items, they more likely to borrow and rent things, repurpose things, and encourage other people to save energy. Though it didn't actually predict all pro-environmental behaviours we measured, so it didn't predict any dietary behaviours or avoiding wasting food, etc. So actually, most of those things that it didn't predict would probably reduce your carbon footprint more than those things that did relate to climate anxiety. And I think that's interesting because of what we know shapes people's behaviour more generally. In other words, that if you are worried about climate change, it may motivate you to do things that are relatively easy to do, that actually are within your control. But then those other things which probably would be more effective may be much harder to do, and there may be wider structural barriers that impact on your ability to do those things. And this relates to my point really about information only being having a very small effect on people's behaviour, because we know that attitudes by themselves actually are only one influence on behaviour. Right, so this very complicated diagram, and it comes from a report that we wrote for the UK government a few years ago, looking at what shapes people's travel behaviours. So in the middle, you've got this blue blob, which are the two sort of key decisions that we were looking at. So it's how people travel. Do they take the bike or bus or car, for example? And do they own a car? Do they make a decision to own a car? In which case, what type of car? So those are the sort of two big travel choices or behaviours we were interested in. And what our research, it was a big literature review basically, what we found was that while there are certain kind of explicit motivations, that's this sort of reddish blob here, that drive people's travel behaviours, and that includes things like, what's the price? Is it a pleasant journey? How much flexibility and freedom and autonomy do I have? Those sorts of factors are very important. But actually there are many other things as well, such as unconscious factors, which people tend not to report, but we know from studies do shape choices, like social norms. So what are other people doing? What are my friends and family doing? Symbolism or status, like what does this choice of vehicle or mode of travel say about me and how important I am, or about my identity? And habit is a really strong predictor. So those unconscious factors are also important. Those sorts of things together, those kind of individual level drivers of behavior, are in turn shaped by what we call this sort of green blob of demographics and circumstances. So it could be your income, your circumstances, for example, whether you have a family, whether you need to drive children somewhere, who you share a house with, etc. All of those situational factors are going to be very relevant. And then this orange blob, which I always think we should have actually drawn much bigger, has a huge impact on people's travel choices, because it's the physical environment, it's the transport environment in which people are making their choices. So this includes whether there is a bus service available, what is the price of the bus, how reliable, regular is it, how walkable is the city in which you live, how attractive, how safe, how well lit. All of those sorts of elements of the transport environment come in there, and they have a very strong influence on the behaviour. What this basically means, all of this complexity, is that while you could intervene to shape people's motivations directly in terms of giving them some information to show that the price of choices is maybe lower than they thought, or to in some way make it attractive to change these things, unless you've actually changed the transport infrastructure in some way, that information is going to have very little impact. So we need to go beyond just information, but sort of somewhere between information and sort of policy intervention, if you like, and sort of structural change is the sort of social influence. And what we can do is to try to reshape and use social norms. We know that people are strongly influenced by other people. They want to do what's normal and what's right. In particular, they're concerned with what people like them think. So people who maybe they share their values and maybe even or live close by as well. And so we look to people similar to us to see what would be the right thing to do. And as a result, when we make it, this is returning to the point I made earlier, when we make a choice to take a climate action, we're conveying this to be normal, attractive, etc. This helps to reshape and create new norms. And it's interesting, actually, the evidence around neighbourhood effects shows that this can work even just in terms of the sort of physical proximity to others. So houses that have, if you live close to somebody who's got solar panels or perhaps an electric vehicle, then you're significantly more likely to adopt those technologies yourself than if you do not see people in your neighbourhood with those things. So the more people kind of do adopt these things and how visible they are, they have an effect on people who live close by. Then there are sort of social interventions that have been used to try to sort of I guess use social norms to persuade people. So the eco teams intervention was one example where they got together groups of households on a regular basis who were interested in reducing their carbon footprint. So they were already quite motivated, but they effectively got them to make commitments to reduce their carbon footprint. They shared information with each other, which was very tailored, very peer-led, so it was trusted information. And together those groups of people made significant but durable behaviour changes. So getting people together to take action can be effective in that way. But much more effective is actually when we move out to change the context in which people are acting. There is a sort of category of behaviour change, which I'm sure you probably come across called nudging, which is basically changing the choice architecture as in a way that doesn't remove choice altogether, but makes certain choices much, much more attractive and easy, basically. So to give you one example of a study that used a nudge, all they did was that they increased the availability of vegetarian options in a number of canteens. Previously, there had been 1 in 4 of the available choices had been vegetarian. They increased that to 2 in 4, so a very small change, really. You could still choose meat. And that small change by itself increased the sale of vegetarian and vegan options by up to 80% in some cases. A similar example that's even more impressive, I think, is where in Switzerland, the energy company moved all of their customers, about 250,000 people, from previously being on a fossil fuel tariff to then being on a renewable energy tariff, a green tariff. And what they found was that most people stuck with that green tariff. In fact, when they had been on a fossil fuel tariff, only 3% of customers chose to switch to a renewable tariff. When they moved over, when they just made people automatically be on a green tariff, almost 90% of people stuck with that green tariff and did not switch to fossil fuel, even though it would have saved them a bit of money to do that. So people stick with the default. So make it easy, make it the default choice, and actually you will move people quite easily, that people's behavior will work, will change. But this doesn't work with all behaviors. So you cannot, for example, nudge people onto a public transport system if there is no bus in their area, for example. So it works in some cases, but it's not an available option to all types of behaviors. For some of those other behaviors, what we absolutely need to do is change the infrastructure, and transport is a really good example of this, because what we know is that actually changing the physical environment to make it easier for people to walk and cycle by, for example, reallocating road space away from cars and giving some of that space to cyclists and pedestrians, means that it's harder for people to drive. There's less space on the road, so it's less easy for them to drive. And at the same time, it makes it easier and safer and more attractive to walk and cycle. So you change the incentives by changing the physical infrastructure, and that can be very effective. Similarly, you can obviously use economic incentives, and a review recently showed that congestion charging is one of the most effective ways of cutting car use. In London, for example, it's cut car use by up to 33%. This is where you get people to pay for driving within the centre of the city. And in Germany, they've recently reduced public transport costs very significantly as a way of easing the cost of living crisis. But it made people switch from cars to public transport, which was by reducing the economic costs of it. So I've covered quite a lot of different interventions, but actually one of the really key insights from the evidence is the more that you can combine interventions, the better, because usually there are multiple barriers to behaviour change. So as I've already mentioned, it's not enough to give people just information, and so when colleagues try to encourage people to bring their own coffee cup to cafes by just having posters and flyers, that only worked to change 1% of people's behaviour. When they combined it with lots of different other elements, including putting a financial charge on the disposable cup, so you had to pay extra if you took a disposable cup, when they also distributed some free reusable cups as well, so just make it very easy to give for people to bring their own cup. That increased the efficacy of the intervention to 38%. So it makes a big difference the more you add in all these different elements. And the final thing to say on how to change behavior is that it really matters when you do it. So up until this point, I've really talked about how, but what's often forgotten is that it matters when, because habits are a really big barrier to behavior change. If you think about maybe your own journey to the university or to the shops or wherever you need to go, you probably don't think, how am I going to get to the university or to the shops? You just take the same mode of transport that you always do. There would have been a time maybe when you first moved into your accommodation or first started the university that you did consciously think about, okay, how am I going to get there? But once you've kind of made that decision and made that choice several times, it becomes a habit. So it becomes basically an unconscious response to a cue. And that cue may be, it's 8 o'clock in the morning, I need to go to university, and you just automatically drive or walk or whatever is your chosen mode. But that makes it very difficult to change behavior, because we know that people tend not to pay attention to information when they have strong habits. So you can have lots of campaigns and information and maybe even some incentives, but people probably don't notice them because they have this sort of autopilot, this unconscious response that is triggering their behavior. However, habits are weaker during certain periods of time, certain moments of change, we call them. These are basically periods of time where there's some disruption in the context. And a classic example is moving house. So when you move house, you have to think about, how am I going to get to the places I need to go to? And at that point, you are actually deliberating over information and the relative pros and cons of different modes of transport and routes and so on. So you've moved from that habitual mode of decision-making to a more deliberative, conscious mode. And at that point, if there is an intervention, for example, in this case, what researchers did was they gave some tailored bus timetable information and a one-day pass to try the bus for free to people who had recently moved house. And they also had a control group of people who had not recently moved house. And what they found was that actually that information was very effective to increase bus use amongst the people that had just moved house. They increased it from 18% to 47%, so over double the amount of bus use. Whereas the people that had not recently moved house but had had the same intervention, there was no significant increase in their bus use. So it really makes a difference when we intervene, because getting the timing right means that actually people are more likely to pay attention during those moments of change. So my final point, just before I finish, is to say that actually all of this does need people to be part of that decision-making process. So when governments are trying to think about how to change people's behavior, how to change their travel habits or their diets, this implies a very significant amount of disruption. It might be challenging for many people. It might be difficult for certain people in certain circumstances. It's absolutely critical to bring people with you and involve them and engage them as part of that policy design and that decision-making about how to change behavior. And in a lot of the work that we do, we've tried to look at sort of how to do that. So we've looked at citizens' assemblies, for example, citizens' juries, but there are more sort of, let's say, traditional ways of just getting information from people through surveys and focus groups, for example, that shed light on how to change behavior effectively, what might be the barriers to behavior change, what might be effective in motivating people, and so on. Because we know that imposing solutions on people doesn't work. We've seen protests where that hasn't, where they haven't consulted effectively. And we know that more participatory forms of decision-making tends to improve the quality of decision-making, actually, because where you factor in potential barriers and potential groups that might be affected and think about ways to mitigate the impacts on certain groups, then you actually not only get more acceptable outcomes, but actually usually the policy works better. So I'm just going to wrap up there to sort of, these are the kind of key points to say, we do need radical behavioral and social change to reach our climate change targets. We need to focus on the behaviors that are most impactful. So in many cases, that's likely to be travel behaviors, food choices, energy use, as well as material consumption. But we also need to think about the behaviors that people take, not just to reduce their own carbon footprint directly, but as professionals, as members of communities, as citizens. We need to co-design interventions with the public, with communities, in order to make sure that they are engaged, brought with us, and that those co-benefits I talked about are embedded in those interventions, so that we do make sure that the low carbon choice is more attractive, is healthier, is cheaper. We need to implement a combination of interventions, both downstream and upstream interventions, and particularly the upstream is critical to remove those barriers to behaviour change I talked about. And we need to get the timing right. So we need to make sure that interventions are timed to when people's habits are disrupted and weakened, so that interventions are more likely to work. So I'll stop there and I welcome any questions or comments you might have.
Thank you, Lauren. Questions? I have a question, but I'll park it for later. Yeah.
Very fascinating overview. I come from a different perspective, so a lot of things opened up for me. A couple of questions. You are mentioning that the electric car usage significantly reduces the CO2 emissions. So the source for the energy is still petrol, right? So as long as that is the same, does it still remain the same? And the second part of it is, in order to do this, there's mining of various metals that are being done, right? So which in turn causes a lot of other pollutions. So from a long-term impact, how does that one factor in? And one other final question is, there is a lot of information asymmetry. The poorer people have less informed, the richer people are more informed, and the interests are also aligned. So economic interests gives them disincentive for the rich people or the industrialists to change. So how does one influence the policy? How do you energize the people? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's some great questions. On electric vehicles, yes, you're right to point out that it depends how the electricity is made. And so it absolutely will, electric cars in any case produce less emissions at the source at which they're being used. So however the electricity is produced, it will be less polluting within the city, but it has to be made by green energy to be really a low carbon form of transport. So you have to use renewable energy ideally to charge your batteries. So it depends what's happening with your energy supply system. In the UK, we are actually doing reasonably well in terms of decarbonising our supply, but yes, you're right to point out it is that's a really important factor in terms of how much emission savings come from driving electric vehicles. And you're absolutely right as well to point out that there are other environmental considerations with electric vehicles that mean that they may not be as sustainable as they seem from a purely climate change point of view. So if we factor in wider pollution, biodiversity loss, etc., then there may be other reasons why we should be cautious about moving to electric vehicles. This is, I mean, in some other stuff that we've talked about, we've emphasized that actually there are far more co-benefits from getting people out of cars altogether. So living car free was the top one, and then it seemed like using an electric vehicle was nearly as effective, but that's from a purely emissions perspective. If you look at health, equality, well-being, various other like congestion factors, all of those sorts of things would suggest actually we just need people to be driving much less. And so, yeah, I would sort of agree with you basically that I think electric vehicles are a partial solution, but definitely not the full solution to transport problems. On the asymmetry, again, a really important point. I only very briefly talked about involving people in decision making. And part of the reason I think we need to do that is not just because it means that then we can have more effective and acceptable policies, but also because people that rarely have a voice in decision making and policy making can try to be involved in and influence that process. So you're absolutely right that richer people and people with more power and influence are the ones that are making the decisions at the moment. We absolutely need to hear what are the issues and implications for people on lower incomes, people with vulnerable groups, etc. And through those more participatory processes, at least we try to sort of involve those groups as much as we can. That's part of it. That's obviously not all of it, because there are vested interests, and that's a whole other sort of set of issues around kind of how we need to transform society. And yeah, probably beyond the scope of my sort of talk to talk about behaviour change, but yeah, we absolutely need to address the fact that there is lobbying, and that's one of the key things that governments need to address is industrial lobbying, which then means that policies that are for the benefit of climate and for society do not necessarily get enacted.
Any other questions? Students, especially environment and psyche.
Hi, I'm Pujvi. I'm a psychology major, and I was thinking while you were giving the talk that when we are making our choices, we need to very consciously think about towards climate change, right? But when you think at a societal level, a very simple example, if, and I'm talking this about myself too, like if I go to a shop and if I have to choose between eating a vegetarian meal or a non-vegetarian meal, the reason I would not choose a non-vegetarian meal would be because of, say, religion. It won't be because of climate change. And I can say it on behalf of many of my peers and friends. If they are, say, going to buy some clothes, they will make that choice on basis of trends and fashions and will not give a single thought to sort of how many liters of water was used to make a particular t-shirt or cloth. So, like, I know there may be no answer to this, but at a more larger level, how do you ingrain that habit that people's first thought before engaging in consumption choices should involve whether it is sustainable or whether my single choice will impact climate change in any way? And my second question was related to something about culture and festivals. So, for example, in India, there's a lot of supple burning, and there is a recently we celebrated Lori, and we burn wood in that, and that obviously causes pollution. But if you were to approach people and say that, hey, this is wrong, there will be arguments there because culture comes in and it's very important. But I mean, we can't deny that it is playing a role in climate change and it is a negative role. So, how do you navigate those conversations where people's values and culture is at stake?
Yeah, thank you very much for those questions. They're fantastic ones. On the first point, I completely agree. And this is why I mentioned that actually, while people do sort of broadly say they care about climate change and the environment, we know that their day-to-day decisions tend to be much more motivated by, yeah, what is the cost of this? Does it look good? Is it in line with my religion? Those much more immediate factors and cultural factors influence people's choices much more strongly. And that's why it isn't very effective to just communicate, like to put carbon labels on things. Like for a small percentage of the population, that might be, oh, this is something I want to do something about, and they might notice it. But for most people, there will be these other overriding factors that mean that actually I still don't want to change my choice. And that's why we need to make it cheaper, more attractive, and more in line with these motivations that people have. So if you can just make it the cheapest option, then people that are motivated by price will just buy it, whether or not it's sustainable. So make the sustainable choice the cheapest option, make it more attractive, so have it be designed better, etc. And where already within cultures that are more where there is religions that are more aligned with vegetarianism, then that works in favor of having plant-based diets. That's great. In other cultures, in the UK, for example, it's the norm is more to eat meat, and so it's more difficult to we have to then try to change those norms. There are technological solutions that are part of that. We have plant-based meats that are coming onto the market, and that's helping to move people away from red meat, for example. But we also have to just change people's attitudes towards meat consumption within cultures like mine, to say, and it actually, the fact that there are health co-benefits of eating less meat is helping, because people are now starting to move away from meat for that reason primarily. So there is a shift. But then this does relate to your second point, which is around where there may be religious and cultural reasons why people don't change. That is really difficult. And again, there may be some technological solutions where maybe there is certain types of wood or materials that could be burnt that have a lower, lower emissions. So that could be the easiest way of doing it, is finding like a way that doesn't revolve around behavior change per se, but has a more sort of a technological solution. Or, I mean, there have been examples of using religious mechanisms to get people to change their safety behaviors. That there was a classic study of where they were trying to encourage communities to use seatbelts in their cars, and they were refusing to do it and saying, actually, it's God's will if I die, and so I don't think having a seatbelt is the right thing. And then the authorities spoke to the religious leaders of this community and said, we need you to actually help us kind of engage and protect people. And so they got them to like bless the seatbelts and actually tell the people in the communities, this is okay. This is in line. This doesn't contravene your religious code to actually put on seatbelts. So in that situation, there was a way in which they worked through the religious leaders to kind of change behavior. So I don't know if that's something that would be an option in this case, but there have been cases where cultural and religious traditions have been adapted in order to address, well, in that case, it was a safety concern, but it could be like an environmental concern, I think, in this case. So yeah, I don't know. I would be interested to know if people have done work in this area, but I'm not sure, to be honest.
Hi, my name is Kshama. I'm also a psychology student. So I also wanted to ask you a question. So I think a few days ago, I was reading something somewhere which said that people who care, climate change affects them more who care a lot about environment. And it's a very interesting argument, I believe, because it has a socio-economic, context, because it is said in reference to those who live in forests, communities and tribal groups, and also, people who live in villages and poor people, because they are not the ones really, contributing to climate change as much as, people upward in the hierarchy. So, and then also there is value action gap, right? So I was wondering what you have to say about that, because most of the time, we believe in certain values, but it's not really reflected in our actions, especially when it comes to environment. And, we talk about saving environment and all of that. So I was wondering what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I think, you've touched on a number of things that I sort of alluded to in the talk. The value action gap, yes, absolutely. This is why I used that very complex figure with all the blobs to show that lots of factors shape our behavior, not only our attitudes. In fact, our attitudes tend to be a relatively small influence on our behavior. It's often the context, the situational factors, which are a stronger driver, which is also why, as you say, poorer communities have a very small carbon footprint. That's not necessarily because they care more about climate change. It's much more to do with the fact that they don't have income to spend on stuff, on traveling more, on lots of other things that cause pollution, compared to higher income people. And in fact, in some studies, the relationship is the opposite. Actually, higher income people sometimes express more environmental concern, but it doesn't manifest in their behavior. So yeah, absolutely. The implication of that then is that we can't rely on downstream interventions. We can't rely on information provision, on education. Those things are important, it's worth saying. Like, we should have them because we need to explain to people that there are climate risks and that we have to change our society, and we have to all be part of that. So we do have to inform people about that. And I think education has a role to play in terms of strengthening the relationship between people and the environment, because we know that people that connect to and value the environment more tend to choose greener things. So there is something important there that education at a young age in particular can do to shape that. But we absolutely need much more upstream. We need the policy interventions to make it, easier, cheaper, more attractive for people to do the right thing. We need to embed that within society so that the default choice is the low carbon choice for everybody, so that it isn't only, the very motivated, committed people that want to, overcome these obstacles that make some choices in that direction.
Hi, Professor. My name is Shloka. I'm a second-year environmental studies student, and I just had a question regarding your talk. So what do you think is the scalability of these individual measures, as compared to policy measures that can actively curb these emissions by industries? And keeping this in mind, how would you go about assigning blame? Would you assign more blame to the individual or to large-scale corporations and government agencies?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I didn't mean to imply that the interventions that I was talking about, or well, most of them were sort of small scale. Actually, some of them were actually. So like the eco teams thing was a very, very small scale kind of grassroots type intervention, and probably not particularly scalable actually. Whereas we absolutely need policy intervention. So that most of the upstream stuff I talked about really is policy intervention. Some of it could be at the organizational level in terms of businesses, how they kind of do things, but actually a lot of it is about economic policies, it's about regulation, it's about investing in infrastructure, changing the design of cities. So absolutely that's scalable. That's at a national level, it's, you know, beyond that as well. And that's what we need far more of. And then that does suggest, to answer your second question, that a huge part of the whether you call it blame, but responsibility for change is with governments. The way I kind of like to think about social change is that there are three elements. There's governments, there's businesses, and then there's kind of the public and citizens. And those three elements all have to be part of the change. We can't do it just with government intervening alone. Everybody has to kind of be a part of it, etc. Businesses are starting to see opportunities to be green, and so that in some cases there are incentives that align with business interests that mean that they are playing a part, but they need to do far more. Similarly, individuals face lots of barriers, so they need to be encouraged. But governments have a huge amount of power to enable all of these actors to move. They can remove these behavioural barriers, they can remove the economic barriers that businesses face to going green, etc. So I would say governments are the top, but we all need to play a part.
Am I audible? Hello. Okay, I'm Meenakshi. I'm a psychology major. I just want to say thank you. I found the talk really interesting and comprehensive, and I was curious about your perspective regarding more performative forms of protests for climate change. Specifically, I'm talking about the organization Just Stop Oil, but I'm sure that there are other examples. And their protests in the past have been seen to be quite polarizing. And I wanted to know if you thought that that was more beneficial or detrimental when it comes to mobilizing pro-environmental behavior.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I haven't specialized in terms of protest behavior, but my understanding of the literature is that protest is a key element in achieving social change. Like, it can highlight issues that the public may not be aware of. It can highlight the strength of public feeling to government, so they can be provided with a mandate for enacting policies that achieve change. So protest is a really important lever, and people, and one of the roles that we can play is as citizens to protest. With regards to the specific tactics, then yes, it's going to be sort of depend on the extent to which you take the public with you in your protest activities versus just try and cause kind of maximum disruption and potentially risk some people kind of being or losing support through those actions. There was I'm trying to remember who it was, a group in the UK recently, I think, evaluated Just Stop Oil in terms of whether they had dented public support for climate action. And they found that it had no negative impact on public desire for climate action. But they didn't ask, like, do you think, do you disagree with these tactics? I don't think they asked those questions, which there may have been some disagreement. But so I think it's difficult to say, in terms of the specific, the right balance between staying within what the wider public support, and then going beyond that to be more disruptive in terms of how effective that is in the longer term. So yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't have a very good answer, I think.
Anyone else?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Smriti. I'm a fourth year environmental studies student. So most people are driven by their consumption practices in search of symbolic utility. And these are basically what you mentioned as unconscious factors in the motivations that drive them. And often these consumption practices are not environmentally friendly. Because people are seeking novelty, and because of that, it causes some sort of environmental degradation. So if you were to make that transition from towards a positive environmental consumption, how do we make environmental practices somewhat a novelty without individuals foregoing their freedom and identity?
Yes, another great question. You're asking loads of really, really good questions. I actually think that is one of the biggest challenges that we face, actually, is how do we radically reform consumption to achieve both, let's say, psychological human needs, but also business needs to make money and to keep the economy going, etc. The drive towards having a more circular economy, where we're repurposing things, for example, an old mobile phone maybe can be reconditioned, and you can actually reuse many of the parts, and so it has a lower carbon footprint through that, and holding on to things for longer so we don't replace them quite as often. Those things can, all these things that are part of the circular economy mean that then you can still businesses can still make money, because you maybe make money out of repair and repurposing more than making stuff out of like virgin materials. So there are things that can be done there, and then you satisfy that desire to have something that is ostensibly new, albeit it's made of elements that have been used previously. There's also evidence around moving away from material consumption to more kind of experiential consumption and spending time in different ways. So I touched on this when I was talking about the relationship between materialism and well-being. There's this negative relationship between people who consume lots of stuff and actually who feel happy. And yet we're told that, we're marketers and advertisers tell us the more stuff we buy, the bigger house we have, the more we travel, etc., the happier we'll be. That's implicit or even explicit in a lot of advertising. But the opposite is actually the case. And the reason for that is, if you look at some of the psychological research on, based on the sort of hierarchy of needs and self-determination theory, that actually what we really need to be happy is spending time with other people, like having a social connection, doing something that is fulfilling in the sense of like feeling that we're good at it, so having a sense of competence, and having some sense of freedom and autonomy. So those are the three sort of main psychological needs we have. And actually, if you look at material consumption, they don't map on well. They don't actually achieve those things very well. They do achieve that kind of novelty stimulation thing that gives you a kind of short-term endorphin hit. But actually, in terms of deeper psychological fulfillment, it's these other things like doing things as a community, maybe volunteering, doing something creative, like a creative hobby or something musical or artistic or whatever, spending time in nature. All of those sorts of things tend to be much more fulfilling on a deeper psychological level. So what we need to be better at is communicating to people that the way in which you can be happy is not through buying stuff. That gives you a short-term hit, but actually is not very satisfying. It's these other things. So we need to, I think, kind of educate people maybe about the roots of well-being. And we need to also make sure that businesses are not making that more difficult for people, so that there are economic models and business models that mean that people can actually, there is a sort of way in which businesses can still make money that is aligned to that. So that might be through offering experiences rather than material goods. So that's a huge topic about which I there's lots of things that I am not an expert on within that in terms of kind of economic models. But yeah, I think you're talking about something that is a very challenging issue, but a really, really massive massive one. So thank you for raising it.
Oh, hi, my name is Lana. I'm also a psychology student. So obviously there are a lot of people who are worried about climate change, but I think there's also a good amount of people who deny global warming and climate change, and clearly speaking to them, awareness hasn't gotten through to them. So how do you suggest, we bring about individual changes in that community where they actively deny global warming and climate change?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We've done work on this, actually. How do you engage climate skeptics and climate deniers? And while in most countries, the numbers of climate deniers has declined, it has also kind of, that group has maybe adapted to now to be climate delayers. So in many cases, people don't necessarily say there's no such thing as climate change. They may say, but they may be more likely to say we can't afford to do anything about climate change now because we've got another crisis to deal with that's more important. And so how you deal with those people is actually similar to how you deal with people that deny the existence of climate change, which is that you actually reframe the message altogether. If you are talking about climate change to people that do not believe in climate change, they will completely ignore you. And we've done experimental studies showing that. And in fact, they may even just strengthen their existing beliefs because of the way in which, because of confirmation bias, like given any information, people will just look for the bits that confirm what you already believe, and often strengthen that belief. So it's difficult to challenge people that have very strong views. So what you can do instead, and there are studies that have done this, is completely reframe it. So you're not necessarily talking about climate change, you're talking about how can we reduce energy bills? How can we have a more secure energy system, be more self-sufficient in our energy? How can we have green jobs? And in many cases, those are we talk about those as co-benefits, but if you make those like the primary benefit, but incidentally, actually, these are things that reduce carbon emissions, then you can engage those audiences. So you don't talk about the thing that they say is nonsense, climate change, you talk about something that you know they care about. So we've looked at this across the political divide, because those on the right of centre politically tend to be less concerned about climate change and maybe more likely to deny climate change. So by talking about, we found in our studies that by talking about things like green jobs, energy security, health, those are things that they do care about. And so they were more likely to be persuaded about those things that incidentally do actually reduce emissions. So reframing is the solution, I would say.
Thank you, Lauren. So I have a question. I think. So, okay. So I think we have had this discussion in our meetings as well, but it also kind of connects with the kind of discussions I have had with this course and another course that I'm teaching, which happens to be ecological economics. Is the point is that the relationship between materialism and well-being, which I think it's well studied, tend to have a negative or inversely proportional relationship. But I would argue it happens after a person has reached some level of material saturation, which happens to be the case for most of global north, where people have reached that level of material saturation. So I think Smriti also was kind of asking this question, that it is for the global south, having more material access is the only way you can exercise your individual autonomy and individual freedom. And also it provides you a greater sense of individuality per se. So, so in that context, all these messages that tend to work in the global north seems completely impossible in the global south, because people's priorities are very different, and it's like almost denying their individuality to themselves, to them. Like if you are going and saying that you don't move up, then you are denying individuality. So just like we have had the discussion in the class as well, the cycling. So cycling tend to have much higher well-being outcome in the global north, because it is an environment, it is seen as environment friendly practice. But in the global south, people hate cycling because it considered to be whatever, not stopping one to exercise individual freedom, and they can go up in the ladder to a motorized two-wheeler and then to a car and so on and so forth. So how you think that the studies in the global north would have impact on the global south, or do we need to have complete separate set of studies for the global south, because the context is very different and we cannot afford global south to become global north one day, and then we will act with the understanding that we are seeing in the global north. So how you, because it's basically kind of going to the broad idea of leapfrogging, like how we realize leapfrogging, which is basically global south becoming going to a sustainable form without necessarily taking the route that the global north has taken historically. Is how do you think is possible? I know there is no right answer to it, obviously. It is the most biggest research question, but what do you think, like how we should at least approach such a question? What would be the starting point from more from your psychological training and research understanding?
Well, thank you. And you're right that I probably don't have a brilliant answer to that question, because it's huge and it's a little bit outside my direct area. But what I would say is you're completely right to point out that so much of the evidence that I have relied on and that is like published is based in global north. And so we absolutely need more evidence that is based in the global south to know whether the arguments and the theories that we're making do in fact apply elsewhere. So you're completely right with that challenge that we have a skewed evidence base. However, in one of the studies that I presented, we did do a cross-national study. This was the relationship between well-being and pro-environmental behavior. So we had India, we had South Africa, we had China and Brazil and UK and Canada, I think. I can't remember all of the countries, but India and UK were for sure in there. And in every country, we found a positive relationship between well-being, subjective well-being, and pro-environmental behavior. And we measured pro-environmental behavior, this is quite important, in a very broad way, in terms of not just like not just things like cycling, like transport behaviors, but a wide range of behaviors that covered things like working as a community to reduce our carbon footprint, or like doing things with friends and family and colleagues at work. So all of those different behavioral contexts I mentioned, as well as directly reducing your own carbon footprint. So it's quite a broad definition. So according to that broad definition, people have higher well-being that have a lower that have higher pro-environmental behaviors. So I think that that suggests that there is something maybe cross-cultural, and that it isn't that even people, now I guess actually maybe, but probably a caveat there is that a lot of the people we surveyed would have had higher incomes. Actually, because we were using an online survey panel. So they would probably have been middle-class people. So that is a really important caveat. So I think you're right to also point out that the kind of hierarchy of needs stuff and this relationship between kind of life satisfaction and income, it's a curved relationship. So there is people do become happier as they get more income and as they get a better quality of life up to a level, and then it kind of flattens out and then potentially even declines a little bit. So yes, you do need a certain standard of living and income and material things to meet your basic human needs, of course, definitely. And I should have probably had that as something I said before, but once you've got to that certain level of basic human needs, then in fact, the more stuff you consume, despite what advertisers tell us, we do not get happier. We absolutely do not. In fact, we potentially get less happy. So people that value material goods are less happy for sure. That's very clear. And so, yeah, and so I think so there's that caveat of, yes, we need to leapfrog in terms of like getting people up to that standard of living whereby they have their basic human needs met and they have warm homes or cool homes or homes that are comfortable, and that they can travel around and so on, and they can feed themselves. But and so that needs to be done in a low carbon way. And we are seeing like some of those low carbon development trajectories are emerging within developing countries, I understand, but it's not my area of expertise. And we are learning a lot from the global south in the global north. I think this is another thing. If you look at some examples of cities that are doing really well to reduce their carbon footprint, many of these examples are in the global south. But yeah, and so I think that the learning is in all directions. But once we get, and this is happening a lot, you know, with the rising middle classes in India and elsewhere, then once people get to this standard of living, we need to communicate to people, you're not going to be any happier by buying more stuff. We need to communicate that actually the roots of well-being are more to do with like connecting with people, with doing something fulfilling, with like, you know, etc. The things that we know from cross-cultural studies do meet people's psychological needs.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other final questions? From any of you? Considering there is some 2 minutes there, I'll just I think what you said is correct. But one more thing that actually in India we are observing more clearly is that although living in community tend to seems a lucrative option in the global north, in India we have seen how joint families has broken down into nuclear families, and it has happened rather recently, maybe the last 3-4 decades. And honestly, like in India, given a choice, people would, because of the religious and the cultural norms which are much stricter, kind of limit individual freedom, people tend to live in individual homes, and individual nuclear families have become the norm, literal, and not in rural areas, but in urban areas, even semi-urban areas. So again, like living in community, although seems very aspirational in the global north, I don't know how much of it a country like India we would like to do, because here still those social norm, cultural norms are quite strong. If you go and live in a community, they might be quite oppressive. They might not have social justice outcome. Individuals will be oppressed by the expectations of the elders in the community, and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's just one more layer of complexity which we have observed, that at least I have observed in my life. I know most of the people of my age have seen this shift from joint family to nuclear family, and maybe the students have mostly experienced only the nuclear family life. So yeah. I'm just kind of asking, do you see that when that shift has happened in UK, like this joint family to nuclear family, I think it has must have happened much earlier in terms of time, right?
Yeah, this is I'm definitely not an expert in this, actually, I have to say, but I think you're right to point out that we shouldn't romanticize any idea that being part of a community necessarily makes people happier or has environmental benefits. There are, I think that some of the self-determination theory makes clear that having social connections, like there's so much well-being literature that says that people that just do not have any social support tend to have lower well-being. So some level of social support is important, but the right level and the right format, and like whether you're part of a sort of extended family or nuclear family or living on your own or whatever, but part of a community, like I'm sure there are different things that work well for different types of people. So it's probably not right to impose a particular social structure, but sort of just recognize that the direction, very individualistic cultures like the UK, for example, US, etc., where we maybe just have lost a lot of our social connections. People are not happy, and yet by making those social connections, there could also be potential wider social sustainability benefits as well as well-being benefits. So it's about finding those areas where it improves well-being as well as environmental outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lauren. So is there any final questions? Okay, yeah, sure. This is the last question.
Sort of a very naive observation. I just want to get your thoughts. One of the things is if you can localize everything to a greater extent, in the sense like movement of traffic, movement of products made locally, consumption of that. Is that something that is, because I didn't see that in your presentation. So would that, do you think would help in terms of reducing the footprint?
Again, this is a little bit outside my direct area of expertise, but probably yes. I think there would be caveats, because I think in terms of global trade, there are likely to be benefits in terms of development, but there is good evidence around, for example, travel, that like around the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood, that actually if you meet in the UK, for example, since the pandemic, people have started to work a bit more from home or had hybrid working. Some people have moved out of big cities to the countryside, and because they don't need to be in the office every day. And so what that means is that you could potentially see more local provision of services, goods, services, etc. People spending more time in their communities. And so it links a bit to the last question, like you could potentially see some community regeneration and benefits and connections there, but and because people are traveling less, and so that there could be some nice sustainability benefits from that more local idea. But I imagine it's probably not without its problems, given the reliance that we have on international trade for development, etc. So that's beyond my kind of expertise to know whether it is a great solution. I imagine with any solution there are difficulties, but yeah, for sure, I think localization is part of it.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren, for this excellent talk and more engaging discussion that we had. I'm sure like students of environment and psyche have gained a lot. We have some threads to discuss further in the class. I would request a big round of applause. Thank you again. On behalf of Krea, I really thank you for your time, and I hope we continue our discussions in some form. And hope you can make a visit to Krea if you come to India.
I'll have to walk, of course, but yes.
Okay.
Okay, lovely to meet you all, and yeah, have a good rest of your day. Take care.